Well, thank you so much for joining us for Everything Under the Sun, the AccuWeather podcast. I'm Andy Robb from the AccuWeather Radio Network. I'm joined in the studio by executive producer Ken Prell. Ken, how are you?
All right, Andy.
We're going to be talking all about fires today, both historic and current. And joining us in the studio, we got a couple guests in the studio. Geoff Cornish, meteorologist, as well as volunteer firefighter.
And
here with us.
Friend of the show.
And friend of the show.
He's been on in the past.
Absolutely.
I'm glad to be back.
Absolutely. And also, we have a special guest, AccuWeather's correspondent and field journalist, Blake Naftel, is on the line with us as well. Hi, Blake.
Hi, how's it going?
We are doing great here. So what we're going to do on today's show, like I said, we're going to be talking about historic fires, and Geoff is going to have an update on some of the wildfires and his experience with firefighting.
Absolutely.
But we have Blake on the phone. He's joining us on the show today because, well, last year we did an episode about the Great Chicago Fire. But what you may not know was there was another wildfire raging at the same time as the Great Chicago Fire.
A fire that's really been kind of forgotten in history because the Great Chicago Fire kind of, overshadows it.
Yeah, the Peshtigo Fire. Blake, tell us all about the Great Peshtigo Fire.
Well, that event, simultaneously occurred as Chicago began burning. So at 250 miles to the north of Chicago is the small logging community of Peshtigo, and that's just north of Green Bay for about 40 minutes. And in 1871, that was the one of the stronghold bases of 19th century lumbering. The little tidbit of irony here, William Ogden, who was associated with Chicago, being first mayor there, had a lumber mill in Peshtigo and was bringing wood down to Chicago, through railroad and steam ships, basically to build and expand an ever-growing Chicago. So there's a little twist to this, because he was highly associated with Chicago and Peshtigo at the same time. But that evening, when the fires began, I need to step back here and just talk about the climate setup of 1870, 1871. There was great periods of drought throughout the Midwest, Great Plains, into the Great Lakes. At the same time, you had expansion occurring, lots of logging, very little conservation, no conservation practices whatsoever with slash and burn logging, frequently just being the norm. Debris was left, large virgin forests were hauled out of these regions, and that just sat and baked. So there was a lot of fuel out there in northern Wisconsin, Michigan, into Minnesota, basically forest country. So back up to 1871, that fall, there had been no rain. It was just a tinderbox there. And sure enough, ongoing fires had been pretty prevalent in the months leading up because fires would just be lit. Stumps would be burnt to the kerosene thrown on them and just left. And they would just smolder, and wildfires, forest fires would just spurt up.
Wow.
This was common back then. Everything revolved around fire, too. People used fire for their, day-to-day lives to cook, to get rid of trash, to everything from making metal ware and iron fixtures. So this was kind of a man-made disaster that really took on epic proportions, and not just in Peshtigo, but Chicago, as well as other portions of the Great Lakes into Michigan and also other portions of Illinois. Champaign-Urbana had a fire the exact same night. So this was a widespread event. The catalyst on top of all the tinder that was out there was a strong low-pressure system that was working through the plains and Midwest. Not much moisture associated with, just very strong southwesterly winds. And once that started working into the Great Lakes, that really carried these fires great distances and fanned them out. And the atmospheric conditions were prevalent, especially up in the Peshtigo region, for a literal firestorm. Eyewitnesses describe tempests of fire tornadoes whipping through the forests, through the village. And it was a terrible tragedy because there was warning, if you just paid attention to your surroundings in the weeks that led up to this disaster on October 8th, fire was everywhere. The atmosphere was just filled with smoke. Just imagine that, living in that environment for weeks on end and tolerating it. And then suddenly this enormous fire just vents through town.
Yeah, not only that, but the wind was a huge factor with wind gusts over 100 miles per hour. It looks like it says it was over 100, about 110 miles per hour, which really helped fuel that fire, correct?
Yeah, those were local reports at the time, probably just estimates within that firestorm as it worked up from Green Bay through Oconto up towards Peshtigo. By the time it reached the town, it was literally its own weather system, as you've seen typically in modern times out in the West, in Northern California and up into Canada. Same scenario. The town of Peshtigo at that point in time was only 1,200 residents, and everybody just fled to the river. That was the only place that they could really, try to escape this, literal hell on earth that was going over them. Several people made it, but the vast majority of the town did not. 800 people died in that town alone that were confirmed. On top of that, there were many other folks in the outlying communities that were unaccounted for, never really noted in the death tolls, and that's why there are estimates up to 1,500 to 2,400 people associated, perished with this fire in 1871. So when you think of Chicago and what was happening there at the same time, yes, that was absolutely horrible. 300 people or more died there. Many others were injured and the town burnt down. You just think north of there in that little rural section of Wisconsin, far different scenario and similar conditions as well.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing about this, Blake, is that, the accurate death toll could never really be determined. Most of the local records were actually destroyed in this fire.
Yes, that's true. And best account of the entire ordeal was by the Reverend Peter Pernin, who was based between Peshtigo, Marionette, and Oconto. And without that vast description of the before events and afterwards, during, in fact, he was one of the people that survived the fire in the river, the cold Peshtigo River. Much would not have been very well known about this fire until word started spreading and people from adjoining towns, Madison, further south, started coming up to investigate it.
And the cold water was also a reason why, there were some fatalities, correct? Because people were jumping into it to escape the fire, but, that would lead to instances of hypothermia or even drowning.
They were there for hours. It wasn't just being in the water for 30 minutes or so. Residents stayed in that river for up to 5 hours at a time. And this was October. It was a cold river. And most people did not swim in those days. The river was not used for recreation. It was a lumber river. It was very unfamiliar territory to be sheltering in a river or covering yourself with mud just to survive the flames that were flying over you and just devastating everything around you. Yeah, terrible conditions. Reports have folks coming out of the river probably like 2, 3 in the morning, and this fire really had begun probably around 9 or 10 in the evening. Not a pleasant scenario to think about.
The high winds that you mentioned earlier, Blake, caused almost like a kind of fire tornado where rail cars were actually literally airborne. I mean, that's so rare, right?
Yeah. And railroad tracks just completely obliterated. The whole town, short of a few things remaining standing, a kiln, part of a woodenware factory steeple, there was nothing left. And on top of that, the fires didn't just stop at Peshtigo. They fanned northward all the way into the portions of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Flip also to the fact that embers were being carried, far distances into the mid-atmosphere. Now, this isn't confirmed, but fires were also touched off potentially by embers from the Wisconsin and Illinois fires over in Michigan.
Wow.
Along the lakeshore from South Haven, Saugatuck to Holland. The early community of Holland, Michigan had a very substantial fire. And that continued across the mid part of the state in spots through Lansing had reports of fires, Grand Rapids, and then another vast fire over near Port Huron through Thumb. At the same time, you had another fire occurring almost simultaneously up in from Manistee to Alpena in northern lower Michigan, burning down that section of the forest. So multiple fires all at once between October 8th, the evening into the 9th, and the fires really didn't subside until the 10th.
Geoff, with those conditions, your thoughts on that? How unlikely is that of a scenario?
It's an incredible scenario. A lot of the time we associate the brush fire season in the Great Lakes in the Northeast with the springtime, right before things really green up, when the formerly living vegetation, from the previous growing season has yet to green back up. And a lot of the time, if we get a dry spell in March or early April, we're in big trouble. But it takes a significant drought to produce those kinds of conditions into the fall. Growing up in the Philadelphia area, late summer of 1999, we had a spectacular drought, and we had brush fires on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. But life is a little easier now than it was in the 1800s.
Right.
Suppression
That's
techniques
one thing,
are much better.
We have to really keep in perspective as we're talking about this.
Absolutely. But, this kind of thing can happen again, and especially in more remote areas, it can absolutely happen. And, in some ways, we're in way better shape now than we had been in the past. But in other cases, we are producing our own fires in more volatile ways now than in the past. If you look at how people are building into the urban-rural interface there in the rugged terrain of parts of California, mm-hmm. Everybody wants a great view out their backyard. They have the infinity pool and all that. It's mm-hmm. fantastic living, I guess, until fires pop up.
Right.
And now you have real volatile, dangerous situations where really it should naturally be left just to the wild.
Yeah.
But we're building in more dangerous places. So you could look at this either way. I imagine if this happened today, I can only imagine what the 2019 media landscape would do with a day like that.
Right.
But Blake tells a good story. He's been a storm chaser and he's a weather historian as well. I think the Great Peshtigo Fire probably is our nation's worst natural disaster that a lot of people have never heard of. A lot of people know about the Galveston hurricane in 1900, but this fire killed as many people potentially as Katrina. As Blake said, this is not the most notable fire in the history books, even that day in the Great Lakes region, the Chicago fire. One of those cases where the big cities seem to often get a little more
Of course, they always
attention.
dominate the news cycle.
So is that was the question that I was going to ask. So, I feel like I kind of knew the answer, but Blake, is that the reason why, one of the reasons why the Peshtigo Fire was kind of forgotten about? Did it just kind of get left behind because everyone was focused on Chicago?
Well, think back to 1871. Communications were really limited to telegraph wires. All of those lines were burnt leading up to Peshtigo, and those were connected for a time. So there's no way to get word out. The earliest newspaper accounts I found were from the 13th of October from Madison, and that was when word had finally carried down that, there had been a fire in Peshtigo.
So you're talking almost a week later before it actually got anywhere else.
Yeah, several days. But the big aspect is that Governor Fairchild at the time sent all the resources that he had to aid the Chicago area from Wisconsin. There was no word up until his wife, Frances Fairchild, learning about the Peshtigo Fire. Once he was down in Chicago, that there had been an even worse tragedy further north, that help was waylaid up to Peshtigo and points that further north. So fortunately for her, she was able to get a couple of trains to head north with supplies. And that is really when the extent of what had happened up there started getting out, just back and forth from train car rides and people aiding in the disaster that had unfolded up there. So it was, so many different factors, such a different world for sure. Just there's no instant communication or texting or photos. It's, hey, almost a week later, this maelstrom has unfolded up there. So
Over 1 million acres burned. Just incredible stuff.
Yeah, it says 1.2 million acres of forest have been consumed, which is unbelievable to think about.
Yeah. And that, this is just one of several fires that day, that 2-day stretch.
And that was one of the questions you answered earlier, Geoff. I was going to ask, can something of this scale, like the Peshtigo Fire, can this happen again? And Geoff says yes.
I think it could happen. I mean, right now, we're not fear mongers in any way, and we're in far better shape. Fire suppression doesn't compare to the 1870s now, way better. But you look at places like Lexington, Kentucky, they haven't had measurable rain for 31 days now. And if we got the wrong set of ingredients here, if we had a gusty front roll in with very limited moisture, parts of Tennessee into Kentucky have been very, very dry here. Because it has been so dry, the sun is more effective in driving the temperature up. They've had extreme heat, mid to upper 90s, 98 degrees on Monday this past week in Louisville. So it's been a very hot, dry time there. And the fuel for wildfire is absolutely there, even though it's not really present in Pennsylvania because we've had maybe a slightly drier than average start to fall, but we're not doing bad here compared to them.
And Blake, if anyone's interested in following you online, where can they find you?
Well, you could just search my name, Blake Naftel. I'm on Twitter, so that's pretty easy to come across, and sorted amount of websites associated with severe weather history, storm chasing history, and tornadoes out there too. So I'm fairly easy to track down.
Well, we'd like to thank you for joining us on Everything Under the Sun to talk about the Peshtigo Fire. And I really think that coming up in the near future, we would love to have you back on again to talk about more historical events.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been fun talking.
Thank you, Blake.
Thanks, Blake.
Such an interesting story, to find out all about the Great Peshtigo Fire. And, of course, you can always go back and listen to our older podcast about the Great Chicago Fire from last year.
Yeah, that's right. Back on episode 20 with Evan Myers.
Evan Myers, one half
Weather
of
Insider podcast.
You got it. And we're still in the studio with Geoff Cornish, meteorologist here at AccuWeather, as well as a volunteer firefighter. So, Geoff, I want to start by asking your experience with firefighting. When did it start? When did you become interested? And how long have you been doing it for?
Yeah, I became a junior firefighter in the Philadelphia suburbs, a little town called Worcester, 25 miles northwest of the city. My dad was a fire chief for that volunteer department for 27 years. And
so it's in the blood.
It's in the blood, and it absolutely is. We have here at State College, we have 3-4 generation long families that have have involvement as well. And my brother is a volunteer firefighter. He's actually was a rescue captain here with Alpha for 6 years, or he was here for 6 years, and for part of that time he was a rescue captain. And now he's back in the Philadelphia suburbs in the same department as my dad.
Oh, very nice. That's cool.
Awesome. Awesome. So tell us about some of your experience with firefighting, not just how long you've been doing it. We just covered that. Sure. But, some of the things that you've done in your career as a volunteer. Maybe has there been something that was particularly dangerous?
Well, we try not to put ourselves in danger as much as possible.
Right.
And statistically, while people watch the movies and they see
Backdraft.
It's not like Backdraft.
Statistically, the most dangerous thing for firefighters is heart attacks and then issues on the road. Standing out on the highway, on foggy incidents on the interstate and that kind of thing. So the statistics, sometimes the things we fear might be a little bit more Hollywood.
Yeah.
Terrorism, things like that, which are still problems, but the cheeseburger may actually be the thing that takes us out, and that's not going to sell many newspapers. But, but still, we absolutely put ourselves sometimes in dangerous situations. Structural firefighting is never going to be a totally safe thing. I've been a member of 3 different departments, one in the Philadelphia suburbs. The Alpha Fire Company here in State College is something that I'm personally proud of. We have about 100 active members. 96 of us are volunteer. And
that's the great thing about that. I mean, volunteer to go out there, it is dangerous.
Yeah.
And people are being just selfless, that's great.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's fun. It's fun. And here as a volunteer, it's fun because we have 100,000 people in our first due area during the school year. And we cover about 100 square miles. So we have a mix between farmland and rural land. And then also a somewhat urban area, downtown State College. We have 12-floor buildings and things like that. So as a volunteer, we could do the kinds of things that they do in the big cities, at least at times. I was a member here for 6 years from 2000 to 2006, moved away for 11 years, and then came back. The number of calls that we run has increased the number of legitimate structure fires has decreased.
Really?
And, life is a little safer now in many ways. Fire codes are stronger. Code enforcement does their job. And they save a lot of lives, even though it may not seem as exciting or it doesn't have that same Hollywood feel.
Right.
But code enforcement, they do a fantastic job. And also our appliances are safer. Wiring is generally better, and building construction improves. But still, if you get off the beaten path a little bit, you can get into big trouble again with especially older buildings. And, nobody's immune. You can have a brand new, well-built building still cause big trouble.
Yeah. And if you've ever seen, the AccuWeather Network or on AccuWeather.com, Geoff is one of the go-to guys, if not the go-to guy, when it comes to talking about wildfires and about fires. Geoff, how do you feel that you being a meteorologist helps you, not only as a firefighter, but as your understanding of wildfires? How does that help you?
I think it absolutely helps. Wildfire behavior is absolutely dependent on the weather. It all comes down to relative humidity, and wind speed, and also just the preceding conditions that lead to the state of the vegetation, whether it's been wet or dry in the hours and days and months that lead up to any given point. And looking at different types of weather patterns, in Southern California, if you have a stiff offshore wind and the Santa Ana winds are howling, then you have a major volatile situation. If you have a stiff onshore wind, you may still have some trouble, but the nature of the air and the dew point's a little higher. So, as a meteorologist, it certainly helps to understand the big picture, and also have a respect for the erratic nature of thunderstorms popping up over the mountains of New Mexico a few miles away can wreak havoc with the local wind landscape, which can produce some erratic wind behavior and fire behavior for fires nearby. And I bring that up as an example because I got to go to the Ute Park fire in June of 2018.
That's right.
Yeah, that was one of the last times we talked.
Yeah, you called in from that.
And that was neat for me. I mean, because I'm from the East, and the biggest wildfire I have ever been part of was a few hundred acres at Rothrock State Forest in central Pennsylvania, the Treaster Kettle Fire in 2006. But that was a few hundred acres. This was a 36,000 acre wildfire. Totally different scale out west.
I couldn't even imagine.
Completely different perspective, I'm
absolutely.
sure.
Absolutely.
To kind of look at. Well, let's get into this season.
Through the end of September and into October 1st, about 50,000 large wildfires. And again, large is very subjective. But this year, we have had about 40,000 if you keep it apples to apples. So we're down about 20%. That's good news.
Yep.
It's tough to, for me, unless I look at the data, it's really tough to kind of keep my eye on a true north. And sometimes I almost seem critical of the media, and I'm part of that. but video is such a compelling thing, and there's an emotional response when we see video, and it's tough to compare. Anybody can capture great video of a major weather event, and it can look like the sky is absolutely falling. And there are problems, and the long-term trend of acreage burned is up. If you look at year after year after year, for the most part, the average. But this year, we are down 20% in the continental U.S., which is good news. On the other hand, and we're dramatically down in the Northwest, but the exception is in Alaska. Alaska had a blowtorch of a summer on Alaskan standards. They had lots of record heat. They were very dry for a good chunk of the summer. And in Alaska, they average about 1 million acres burned.
Wow.
And that's a lot. That's about as many acres burned in a typical year in Alaska as that Peshtigo Fire on its own.
Yeah.
So in one way, you could say that Peshtigo Fire was huge. But 1 million acres is a lot. That's your typical year in Alaska. This year, they've burned about 2.5 million. So this was more than twice average, much worse than normal in Alaska, and a lot of that expanded into western parts of Canada as well. So they had a really bad wildfire season there, but on the other hand, the northwestern continental U.S. was way below average. In fact, through early September, only 178,000 acres burned in the northwestern continental U.S., and last year it was 1.2 million. The year before that, 1.1 million. So we were down well below that, 1.1 million, 1.2 million. This year, under 200,000 acres into early September in the continental northwest U.S. And I think we could basically say that the fire danger in the northwestern U.S. has ended now. We've had big snow. Once the snow begins to fall, you could put a fork in it. And the snow is restricted to the higher elevations for the most part, some of the interior lowlands of Montana. But the moisture has returned, and it doesn't look like we're going to return to significant volatility up there in Washington and Oregon. California it's still too early to give any kind of an all clear because those Santa Ana winds can blow into November, as we saw with the Thomas Fire, October, November. Still a real volatile time there, until after Thanksgiving when we really get good moisture into the southwest. We can't give the all clear there.
And you can stick with AccuWeather.com as well as the AccuWeather Network for all the information because you're always
We do our best.
you're always on there.
Well, I don't know. We should mention
this guy's always on top of everything.
Oh, he is.
I should mention, I feel like the conversation is not complete without at least mentioning Arizona did have its fifth largest wildfire in its state history earlier this summer, the Woodbury Fire. And that was a big one. So, there are always outliers, but compared to normal, Colorado, most of New Mexico, California, Nevada, we've been okay in those other states.
Before we wrap up, I did have one more question I wanted to ask you.
What do you have?
What is your favorite thing about being a firefighter?
I think being able to help people. I have kids. You look at life differently when you have kids, I think.
Absolutely.
One, and I can't take credit for this, but one of my friends, another firefighter, says you get the chance to help people when they're having their worst day in their life. So, I would want somebody to be there for me, and I think it's meaningful to be able to help other people out in those cases.
That's
great perspective.
Yeah, no, it is.
Well, and you guys do this. Anything in the weather enterprise. Yeah, we're here to make a profit for one reason. We got to put food on the table, but there's also a greater purpose that we serve in weather information.
Right.
It's not just a matter of convenience. Sometimes it really is life safety.
And Geoff, you need more follows too. So if people want to find you online, because this guy, he knows his stuff, man. Where can we find you?
I am on both Facebook and Twitter at Storm of Corn.
There we go. I love it. Yeah, it's great.
Which is also your fantasy team name.
That is, yes. Yeah. I guess I found that it works.
How's your team doing this year?
Not great. I'm at 500 right now.
Yeah, that's where I am too.
I started stronger than I am right now.
You got to start listening to Field Conditions, the AccuWeather Fantasy Football podcast.
Is that Dean DeVore?
No, it's actually Brian Thompson.
Brian Thompson.
Yeah,
okay,
Brian
that's
Thompson's
right. Yeah.
got all the inside information.
I got you. Yeah.
We might have to get him on a week.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah,
well, I'm no
absolutely.
expert on that.
Geoff Cornish, meteorologist as well as volunteer firefighter from the AccuWeather Network, joining us today on Everything Under the Sun. Thanks, buddy.
No, thank you, guys.
Appreciate it so much. And of course, our thanks to Blake Naftel again for talking to us about the great Peshtigo Fire. And we will be back with a brand new episode next week. For Ken Prell, I'm Andy Robb. Thanks for listening to Everything Under the Sun. We'll talk to you next week.